So this is a talk about the connection that I see between musical improvisation and sort of agile software development. And I want to first start by just discussing real quick what is improvisation. By the way, this will be split between some talking and then hopefully we'll get to some music as well, and we won't blow it all up. So improvisation is a lot of the time seen as a form of some kind of like a divine inspiration, like a player is just making up melody notes out of thin air, out of nothing, and that's mostly from the outside, because the real fact of the thing is, the fact of the matter is, you usually need to spend a long time dedicated to mastering your musical tool of choice, and also the theoretic knowledge that, and developing the ear and all that stuff. And basically, improvisation is the culmination of all this work and just applying in real time knowledge that you already have, that you practiced in the, well, not on the bandstand, hopefully. So it's basically just putting together things that you already know in a creative way. And by doing that, generating something new. It's usually being performed over a agreed upon musical form, which is usually a song or a set of chord changes. And the basic idea is the soloist is supposed to create a melody that kind of sounds good or fits the underlying chord changes. And as I said before, it's not out of thin air, it's based on some building blocks that the more you have, the better improviser you are. The more you have the more building blocks you have under your belt, the better your ability to express your ideas in a musical way. So what is agile software engineering? Okay, so the other half of the thing I want to talk about. So agile software engineering means lots of things to lots of people, but to me, it means the ability to react in real time to a constantly changing context of requirements that nobody knows up front and nobody can guarantee. And so there's nothing I can plan in the long term, and I need to be able to tackle the requirements as they come. So I don't have the luxury of pre-planning like 6 months in advance and building some kind of preconceived design or architecture that would be suitable in 6 months. So to me, being agile as a software development, and I'm talking mostly about people who code because that's what I do, is all about being able to react to the changing requirements without degrading the quality of the final product. Okay, so each change you introduce must complement the changing context. Okay, so it's kind of similar to what a jazz musician does while improvising, because when we're improvising to music, there's a constant context that's being changed. The time is moving forward. The chord changes are moving forward as we go along the song. And as a soloist, the mindset should be, how can I complement? How can I make a musical statement over this new context, new change, new chord change that I'm presented with? Okay. So that was kind of abstract, and so I guess the best thing is if we would just demonstrate for a short while. We're going to play a tune by Miles Davis called All Blues, and hopefully you'll get to see improvisation happening in real time. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Thank you. That was All Blues by Miles Davis. Just to point out some of the interesting similarities that I see between these two idioms of self-expression. In a software engineering context, we have the team of developers that they're basically working on the same goal, the same task of implementing as many of the features as we can towards a common goal. And I see kind of a very similar dynamic when it comes to playing improvised music, because there's this kind of shared framework that we all agree upon, and it's not communicated verbally, but we all understand the form of the song that we work on, and we know which point in time within the form we have to follow be on the exact point in time, all of us together, know exactly what's the context, what's the current, chord change, what's the current mood of the tune, constantly listening to each other and feeding off each other. And it's very similar to what happens when you have like 2 weeks iterations or 1 week iteration, and you have to constantly come up with creative ways of negotiating the requirements and delivering them. Both musicians and developers, they have a lifetime of information to cover. It's a constant work of improving your technical chops if you're a developer, or your musical chops if you want to be an improviser, and constantly learning and finding your craft so that you're able to apply it on the fly, on real time when it's needed. So, and I also see this kind of process of imitating, assimilating, and innovation, which means in music, in order to become a good improviser, I think a good idea is to mimic your musical masters, basically. So if we're in the jazz idiom, so that would be John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Charlie Parker, and guys like that. So in order to be a jazz musician, I would start imitating those players and hopefully eventually get to a point where it's by imitating those masters, I assimilate some of these abilities. They rub off and become natural part of my playing. So, and once you're at that stage, you start to innovate. So you're not just quoting Charlie Parker licks or Charlie Parker lines or anybody else's musical lines and musical ideas. You just it's part of your own vocabulary, kind of like learning a language in a way. And I see the same thing in software as well, because it's very common to see developers that read about a new concept or hear about something new in a convention or a book or whatever, and then try to imitate that idea and forcing it onto whatever they're doing. So it's very common, like if someone read design patterns yesterday, so you will see a lot of pattern names in their code because they want to apply that new knowledge in order to assimilate it. And once developers transcend that stage, I think they get to a level of being able to innovate and applying those patterns in a more natural way, not so much forcing them or like using the newest, coolest tools when just to be able to assimilate the knowledge. So we want to transcend that and get to a level where you know what's the right tool for the right problem, and you apply it in a more natural way. And both disciplines, they rely on having a large vocabulary of building blocks that you can take ideas out of and apply them in real time. One way I found to enrich that vocabulary and constantly learning new ways of expressing myself with software and it applies as well to music, is by using what's called imitation exercises. The idea, the key point when using limitation exercises is you want to, and it works regardless of what discipline you're using, you want to limit some of the aspects of operating within the idiom. Let's look at some examples. So let's say we're talking about software, and in the context of software, we have a lot of free parameters that we can play around with. For example, we can try to implement a given algorithm, like a quick sort or something, with just using the keyboard, not touching the mouse. Now, what would that kind of limiting situation teach me? It would probably improve my ability to work with the keyboard quite a lot, right? So I would have to fall to all those keyboard shortcuts and learn how to work with the IDE a little better. One good example is if you want to learn functional programming, it's a good idea to limit yourself to doing things in a functional way, meaning don't use mutation that much. If you want to, let's say you want to implement some kind of a data structure like a tree or a stack or something similar, try to do it without mutating any internal state. And that would force out all those ideas that are related to working with immutable objects. And it would teach you how to work in a functional idiom. And the same applies for the OO concept. So if you want to work and you want to improve your concepts of what object-oriented programming means, so try to limit yourself to the idea of not accessing any data, or write your code in a purely tell, don't ask style, meaning you don't use getters, you don't query data out of objects, you just deal with functions that are void functions, basically, and a bunch of callbacks. That would be pure hardcore OO programming because it maintains encapsulation in a very extreme way. So I wouldn't necessarily say just your next project or when you come to work tomorrow or whatever, don't try to do it on the bandstand. Don't try to do it when you're performing your art. Try to do it as an exercise on your own spare time. So some ideas to play around with is being very extreme about immutability, or being very extreme about with using polymorphism versus pattern matching. Okay, so these are two ends of the spectrum when using functional programming versus object-oriented programming. And one of my personal favorites is try to write unit tests before you even write the code, right? So that's basically what TDD is all about. So it's kind of a limitation exercise, the way I see it. It limits your freedom, but you gain some insights about your design, the quality of your design. You get feedback about how easy it is to test, okay? How decoupled is it from the context it's running in. So all of these is just instances of limitation exercises. And I think it's a misconception that being creative is all about having no limits. I believe the ability to extract the most creative ideas is by limiting some of the free parameters, okay? So that forces you out of your comfort zone. And it's the same when applied to music and applied to software and any other craft, basically. And one thing that's very important for me to say, at least, is don't practice on the bandstand. And this applies both to music and to code. So what does it mean? So it's very common to see players that, basically they practice on the bandstand. They play, and through their improvisation, you're basically hearing about a bunch of boring scales, patterns, preconceived licks or ideas, stuff that's not really creative. And you can tell because you're because it comes out. When the musician is into what he's doing or doing something creative, there's an effect on the audience. It draws the audience in. So whenever you're bored with something, it's probably because the musician is bored with what he's doing or she's doing. So the idea to me, and that's a huge struggle, and the same thing applies to software, because you spend all this time practicing your scales, your arpeggios, your technique, your instrument, and if you're playing guitar, you know that this is a beast of an instrument. It's very hard to master guitar, and it's notoriously hard. And so you need to spend all these hours and practicing these boring ideas, and then you feel kind of this urge to apply all of that when you're improvising with your friends or other musicians. And the same applies to software, because if someone learns some cool new trick, they want to apply it, regardless if it's fitting the context or completely detached. And so I want to stress this out because I see this a lot in code. You want to be able to transcend this point and get to a point where all this information is flowing naturally, and you find a solution that fits the current problem in a more natural way, not so much in a forced, over-designed, over-architectured way, applying stuff that you know, applying a framework that is cool to you now, but it's not really necessary at this point. So all those things to me are like practicing on the bandstand. And I think the most important part is, and again, this applies to both idioms, is just doing the simplest thing that could possibly work and maintaining a you ain't gonna need it kind of approach, where you don't overcomplicate things, you don't build up front for some unforeseen future. You just tackle whatever difficulty or whatever requirement is coming at your way, just like when you're improvising and then the chord changes and you need to switch on whatever you're doing to fit the new chord. So it's kind of similar to me. So doing the simplest thing that could possibly work applies in both cases. If you play tons of notes and you need to switch to a new chord, you're going to have to change some of the notes in order to make it fit. And that's very difficult to do. Whereas if you play just very minimally, like 2 or 3 notes, you play, it's very easy. It might be a lot easier, to accommodate what you're doing to the new chord. And the same applies for software as well. If you have a simple solution that you can evolve on demand, it's better to have that than to have some kind of a heavyweight solution that basically brings you down and slows down your development velocity. What we want to do here now is we'll try really quick to demonstrate some limitation exercises as applied to music. Hopefully you'll get the idea. So first step, I'm going to be very, very simple about things, and we're going to play over some blues. It's a very common chord progression that should be familiar to most of you. And so to begin with, I'm going to play out of a very limited vocabulary. I'm going to use a very simple vocabulary, and that's known as the blues scale. And it sounds something like this. Uri, can you play F? So it sounds something like this. So that kind of a sound, okay? It's very common. So let's try to play through the blues using just these, and these are just basically 6 notes. So I'm going to try to make a musical statement just using these 6 notes over the entire one chorus of a blues. So 1, 2. So that's what's just using the blues scale. Okay, so it's 6 notes. And you have there's a lot you can say with 6 notes. Okay, just to prove to you that simple doesn't necessarily mean bad or lacking or whatever. Hopefully, I don't know. So, okay, so now we're going to be a bit more sophisticated and a bit more attached to what's going on in the background. Okay, so that was like the POC phase. Okay, and now, you know, and now we got some feedback from product people who say, you know, add this and that feature on top of this. So I'm going to use the same framework. We're going to play the blues again, 1 chorus, and I will try to follow the underlying harmony in a more concise way. And I'm going to do it by using the chords. I'm going to draw my lines, try to draw my lines out of the tones that are the underlying harmony, okay, the underlying chord changes. So let's really quick go over the changes. So we have F7 basically, right? So it sounds, the notes that comprise F7 is we have B flat, right? It sounds something like this. But there's also some C in there, I guess, right? Okay, so those are just the tones of the actual chords that are being used in the blues. So right now I'm going to try to use all these tones to describe the underlying harmony, limiting myself to just these 4 notes per chord. Okay, so 1, 2. Something like that. Okay, thank you. So now in jazz, it's very common to use like the palette of colors that you can choose from is wider. So there's like theoretically there are 12 tones in Western music, and in jazz you kind of get to choose from all of these tones. But you still need to make a musical statement out of them. So I'm going to use a richer set of tones beside those 4 basic tones that I've used before to describe the chords in a more rich or lush way, adding some color notes, hopefully. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. That was a bit more, like, less conventional, less explicit about the changes, the chord changes. Okay. Okay. So one additional tool that's very useful and like super important is rhythm. And the idea, as a musician, if you want to work on rhythm, it's a great idea to again limit yourself to using only rhythm. So when we're improvising, we constantly have 3 concepts running simultaneously. That's rhythm, harmony, and melody. Rhythm is what we're going to work on right now. Melody was more of kind of like the stuff we've used previously, and harmony is basically your chord changes, your understanding of the chords. And so let's see how we can invent an exercise that focuses purely on developing your sense of rhythm. So I'm going to limit those two other factors out of the equation. So if I have 3, I'm going to give up on harmony and melody, and I'm going to stick with just rhythm. So I'll choose a single note. And I'm going to use that single note to create an entire solo, hopefully making some kind of musical sense. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So that was just kind of like what a drummer would do. That's the way drummers see the world. So next we have melodic patterns and phrasing. So let's skip melodic patterns and just go to call and response because it's kind of abstract. So the idea of phrasing and call of response is you build your solo like a conversation. Meaning you don't just blow, like you don't just play a stream of chords over the changes. You're trying to form it into a cohesive story in the way of mimicking a conversation. In a conversation, we have the situation of a call and a response. So you say something to someone, and you get a response, hopefully, that's meaningful in the context of what you were just talking. So let's see how that might work in the context of a blues. So it's very common in blues to have a phrase and then repeating that phrase and then repeating it again, but with a slight variation. Okay? So I'm going to try to follow that pattern and apply it to the blues and see where it gets us. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So there was this kind of motivic thing happening in there. So at least that's what I was trying to do. So it's kind of like a statement, and then repeating that statement, maybe changing it slightly, maybe changing the rhythms a bit, maybe changing the notes to fit the new chord. But it's kind of, I try to do it so whatever I play, it's kind of tied to the thing that I just played before. So it's kind of a call and a response idea. We're gonna send you off by playing one more tune or a couple of them, depending on Uri. So let's start with Stella, and then she can. So, what tempo should we take this in?
Slow.
Slow? Okay, so 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. chicken. כן, כזה. וואו. Thank you. That's it for tonight. Okay, so I want to introduce Uri Bechar on bass. Guys, he's not even a bass player, so give it up for Uri. Yeah. My dear friend and colleague Nimrod Argov, who's also not really a drummer. He's a keyboard player, guys. Give it up for Nimrod. Thank you. Thank you. I was Sagy Rozman. Thank you all.